So, functionally speaking, we're finishing off chapter 21 today. There's a verse at the end which I'll leave till next week because it kind of serves as a transition point, but nevertheless, we're specifically covering Acts chapter 21 verses 27 to 39. Okay, following on from what we saw last week, and it continues through the coming chapters. So, let's read the passage and then we'll go from there. So, Acts chapter 21 verses 27 to 39. Now when the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon noticing him, in reference to Paul, in the temple, began to throw all the crowd into confusion and laid hands upon him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was stirred, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along soldiers and centurions, and ran down with them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up and took hold of him, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, and began asking who he was and what he had done. But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another. And when he could not find the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And then he got to the stairs, and when he got to the stairs, he actually was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, for the multitude of the people were following them, shouting, "Away with him." As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago raised a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city, and I beg you, allow me to speak to the people." Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, this continues, as I mentioned last week, from last week's passage, and then transitions us into the coming chapters. I didn't read verse 40 because verse 40 is, as you can kind of read through, the beginning of when he's about to start speaking, which is where the chapter division comes. So I just thought I'd save it till next week.
As a cliffhanger, we'll all come back.
Maybe, yeah, perhaps. There's a fair bit of historical explaining that would need to be done here, just not only in terms of the words you see in front of you, but how we're rendering the words into English, what some of these terms mean. So there'll be a reasonable amount of history, and more this is for a lot of today is going to be about context. There are some theological points obviously to make, but a lot of it will be context and setting things up for the coming weeks, okay? Because that's functionally what the point of this passage is anyway in Luke's part. So let's begin at verse 27. Now when the 7 days were almost over, the week that they'd been there in other words, the Jews from Asia, upon noticing him in the temple, began to throw all the crowd in confusion and laid hands upon him. Luke is pointing out where these particular Jews are from. They're from Asia, not just the region, but the province in this specific reference. So many of the places where Paul's been, like Ephesus, like Miletus, like other places that then the gospel would spread around to, Philadelphia, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, etc., etc. These have obviously come from around the empire and from around the world for Pentecost, just as we saw all the way back in Acts chapters 1 and 2. And here, these are, again, they're being held in distinction from the Christians in this context. So these are the apostate Jews, the unbelieving Jews. From those provinces, many of whom we've already encountered, at least in group form, already. The Jews from Asia are the kinds of people who had already harassed Paul, assaulted Paul, beaten Paul. They knew exactly what he'd been doing, and we've encountered them over the chapters, particularly chapters kind of 12 and following, I suppose, over many of the last chapters, and especially in these last 5 or so chapters since chapter 15. We've seen a number of these instances. Jews from Asia would also qualify as the group that caused the riot in Ephesus back in previous chapters that we saw, chapter 19. They would be very much part of that, and I have no doubt that part of the inclusion here on Luke's part historically would be to highlight them. So some of the Jews that we've seen in just the previous chapters, like the massive riot in Ephesus, are now here. And so that entire chapter was dedicated to that riot in Ephesus, more or less. And these are the men who are now here. And so then they spot him in the temple, and they begin to throw all the crowd into confusion and laid hands upon him. The word confusion here, chaos, you could probably also say in English, but confusion is a more direct translation. They throw them into chaos, into anarchy. The whole point, the premise here is the opposite of order and civility. Because you're going to see this word confusion come up a couple of different times here. Throwing them into confusion, throwing them into chaos, throwing them into a frenzy and other such words which we might use in English. And they seize him, they laid hands upon him, so that reference is. And in verse 28 they cry out, "Men of Israel, help. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and the law in this place." The Jews in Ephesus said that. Jews elsewhere said that as well, the ones who rejected his message. So they've been consistent at least. They against the law and our people in this place, and besides, he's even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. Now, I'll read the next verse just to comment on the lesser of these details. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. There's no indication that he had, but again, not that there'd be a problem with that. But let's unpack these two verses. So again, like we saw last week, although in a different context, we saw last week what a number of the Jewish Christians in the Church of Jerusalem had erroneously come to believe about Paul, because they believed the kinds of men that are being referenced here. This is not a coincidence literarily that we've had the previous story and it flows right into this group of guys, right, who've already encountered in previous chapters. The connection, I kind of made this connection in point last week. The connection is that you have, comparatively new in the faith or young Christians in the Church of Jerusalem who are being spoon-fed things about Paul, not from their leaders, but from the enemies of Paul, the enemies of God, and from those who have been seeking to kill Paul and to continue the work that he did, that he repented of and turned away from. And this is the source of where it's coming from. That's why Luke would flow naturally into this particular account. But let's actually examine what they say. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and the law and this place. Those three things can't be separated, and I'll explain a couple of reasons as to why. Because it's not just theoretical. In English, we use the conjunction "and" in multiple different ways. We can use it often at times to show a linkage of things. When we talk about having food, we talk about having, fish and chips. I'm just picking trivial examples here. Two separate items that are going together in one single dish. We're talking about them in a collective sense, okay? We also then use it in, not necessarily a juxtaposing sense, but we use it in a differentiating sense. And here's what I mean. There will be times where we're talking and we use the conjunction "and" to signify two different things that are actually not together, but in whatever particular context we're referring to them together. In the Greek, the conjunction "and" is often used as a continuation of thought. Okay, if it wanted to put things in distinction, it would use different conjunctions, which in English we translate as "but." Right, da 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 da. But then this happened. Okay, and so that negating conjunction is usually what is used to distinguish between what had previously been said and what comes afterwards. Far more often, though, again, the positive conjunction "and," kai in Greek, is used to link things together and show a connection. And again, we'd be here all day kind of listing various examples. So if one of them, for example, is in Peter's epistles, when he refers to our God and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Okay, the reason why that's significant is because of the very principle I'm talking about. It's not referring to God and this separate thing called Jesus, right? Our God and Saviour, Jesus Christ, right? The usage of that in Greek is actually signifying that those two concepts, in this case, God and Saviour, in application to the subject, Jesus Christ, are actually linked together. Right? It's a definitive statement about his divinity. Right? And that just comes from understanding the basics of how these conjunctions, right, conjoining things, hence the term, work in the Greek. I point that out for this reason. Against our people and the law and this place, by virtue of them using that terminology, now keep in mind they'd be speaking Aramaic here, but Luke's writing it down in Greek, which is the premise or the point of why I'm drawing this out, is the pitfall in the very argument that they're attempting to make. They're connecting our people and the law, right? So not just the law as in like the Ten Commandments, but the law, keeping in mind, is talking about even more broadly the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And even more broadly beyond that, really, the whole scriptures get used at times, referred to as the law, in other words, what we would just call the Old Testament. And this place, in other words, the temple. Okay. Now, nowhere have we seen Paul speaking against Jews who have converted into Christ, for example. Right? Nowhere have we seen him say that the law has been abolished, contrary to Christ's words of think not that I've come to abolish the law, but rather to fulfill it. Nowhere have we seen him say that we're now saved by the grace of Jesus Christ, and so you can now live however you want. Nowhere we've seen that. Nowhere have we seen him say that all the Old Testament customs and traditions and laws, altogether, I'm packaging that together, were irrelevant or were never necessary or were a waste of time, or no, we've never seen any of this, right? So here's why that's so vitally important, because by deductive reasoning we can then find out that this is actually ironically an indictment against themselves. Okay? If Paul were to be speaking against these apostates who have rejected Christ and ultimately, ironically, rejected the law, rejected the true temple, which is the Messiah, etc. If they were actually for that, then Paul would have no reason to speak against them. Right? If he is indeed, if he has been teaching everyone everywhere against our people and the law and this place, then ironically, you're actually not with the law and of God, and you're not with the temple. Your temple has become corrupted and your temple has been rejected, and hence why in all of barely a decade after this time it will be destroyed, which is what of course happens. In saying that he's been teaching everyone everywhere against our people and the law in this place, what he has been doing is teaching everyone against you who have rejected the law and who have rejected the true temple of God, who is Christ. Your understanding and your teaching of the law has become corrupted. It has been infiltrated and diluted and, quite frankly, deluged with all manner of Babylonian mysticism, all manner of traditions which you have brought via Babylon, via Greece, via now Rome, which you have inculcated into the very essence of what constitutes the worship or the system of worship in the time. Again, keeping in mind, I've explained this in a variety of other contexts like sermons or church history classes and stuff. What is being taught by the Pharisees and the Sadducees at this particular juncture in history is what goes on to then become the groundwork of the Talmud. Point being here is that the essence of this statement is a lie, right? Against our people. He's been speaking against the Jews, which hasn't been happening. He's been calling the Jews and the Greeks to repentance. He's been standing against those who reject the Messiah because of his stance that he will abide with the truth as opposed to those who wallow in lies.
It's it's what's known as the wool dust factor. It takes 10
Yes.
times the energy to refute it
Yeah.
than it does to spread it.
Yep.
And the actual wool dust will go around the earth 10 times before the truth actually even gets out of bed.
Yeah, correct. I was about to say that. Yeah, exactly. And so nowhere has he been speaking against the people, but rather calling them to repentance and calling them to turn to the Messiah, who has now come. Nowhere has he been speaking against the law. He's been upholding it and pointing to the threefold uses of the law, as you then see play out throughout his epistles and elsewhere, of course, and pointing to how Christ fulfills the law, and all those in Christ, if they love him, will keep his commandments. Nowhere has he been speaking against Jerusalem, but rather actually pointing us towards the Jerusalem that is above. A statement which, of course, he then makes to the Galatians in Galatians chapter 4, for example, that the Jerusalem above, she is the mother of us all, in reference to the church, that is. The unification of heaven and of earth, as we pray, of course, in the Lord's Prayer each week. And so really, when they say that he is calling or teaching people everyone everywhere against our people and the law in this place, all that can be rendered to in reality is that you as the people, if you've rejected Christ, are actually against the law, and you are siding with the corrupt place in which you stand, as opposed to the place which has now come, which is, of course, Christ. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. And so this is proof positive of the very point I'm making. He has even brought Greeks into this temple which has an outer court that is quite literally called the court of the nations, aka the court of the Gentiles, which was built and designed specifically to symbolize the outer court being the entranceway by which the nations on earth would be blessed through the Messiah, through Christ, and into which they would enter into the presence of God, right? The inner sanctum and the Holy of Holies, right? So he's brought Greeks, the very people whom the outer court of the temple was designed for, into this place and defiled it. And you think you're standing with the law.
But are they talking about the inner sanctuary the Greeks? He's let the Greeks into the place where only the Jews are allowed.
Which is exactly the whole point of why the court was. This is my point.
But that's, not the.
Oh no, sure, they're arguing. Oh no, sure, but that's to my point. Yeah. Is that even if he had, but because by the way, even if, because this is the Luke gives context of verse 29. For they previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, one of the companions he's had along this journey, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. They actually have no evidence that he did. They're just lying. Right? So this is the point I'm trying to draw of how duplicitous this is on both ends. They're lying to the Jews who are there because they have no evidence. They've just simply stated, he even brought Greeks. Says who? And Luke here is highlighting that. They supposed that he had brought. So all they saw was Trophimus in the city of Jerusalem, which could mean nothing, or any let alone anything. And they then use that to say, he even brought a Greek into this temple. With what evidence? Right? So they're lying about it even happening in the first place. But even if he had, none of that would have mattered, because the entire point of the temple complex was the court of the nations being the gateway which would ultimately again be fulfilled. This is the whole point. This is why the temple gets destroyed, because it has become, when he's referring to it being a den of thieves, when he talks about synagogues of Satan, it's not just only talking about the people, it's talking about even the physical structures in which they dwell. This temple has become corrupt, and keeping in mind the glory of God no longer dwells here, right? And we know this for a variety of reasons, but the primary of which comes in the Passion Week, right, in the last week of the life of Christ. Best account, or the most detailed account, is in Matthew, right, kind of chapters 21, 22, 23, and then 24 especially. But certainly chapters 23 and 24 primarily, okay, of the Gospel of Matthew. He gives a series of condemnations against the Sanhedrin, right, against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the high priests, etc. Curses the temple itself, curses the fig tree, right, for being fruitless, The fig tree being a symbol of the people, of the Judeans, or of the Jews. Curses the fig tree for having not borne fruit. This is now the end, kind of latter portions of chapter 21, I believe, of memory. Says that the kingdom will be taken away from you and given to a nation bearing the fruit of it. He then goes on through to chapter 23, condemnation against the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes specifically, kind of the apex of this whole discourse he's giving. He then, towards the ending of that chapter, says, woe, woe to Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets that are sent to her. And then goes on to finish this entire discourse by saying, the blood of every righteous one from Abel all the way down to Zechariah, I will demand from your head. Okay. And then he exits the temple on the eastern side, and we're very specifically told that for a good reason. He exits the temple to the east. He then crosses over and arrives at the Mount of Olives, which is to the east of Mount Zion, and then overlooks the temple. Okay. And that gets missed if you don't understand kind of the context of what's going on there or why that's significant. It's deeply, deeply important. All of what we see through Christ's life, including his birth, but especially onward, is him retracing and replaying and fulfilling the whole story of the Israelites. Right? He's born in the land of Canaan, where Abraham had been moved to. Right? He then goes off into Egypt, right? When Herod commits the great infanticide, kills all the children, right? The firstborn sons. Goes off into Egypt, comes back out of Egypt, just like the descendants of Abraham went into Egypt and came back out of Egypt under persecution, with the firstborn son being killed, like all that stuff playing back from Moses and everything else. Then upon he's of course dedicated in the temple. We of course then fast forward to when he's around the age of 30. He then is baptized in the river, then goes into the wilderness, again symbolizing and replaying the Exodus itself, going off into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights while the people wandered for 40 years, right? All that kind of stuff. We see this playing over and over and over again. And one of the climaxes of this, and actually probably the climax of this entire kind of all the Old Testament stories then playing out in Christ himself, who is referred to as Israel, as the embodiment of it in the literal sense, is that he then exits the temple, he curses the temple, curses the institution that it's become, curses the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. And again, you can read that in Matthew 23 particularly. Exits out the east, goes eastward to the Mount of Olives. This ties back into a portion of Ezekiel, where in Ezekiel's day, and we touched on Ezekiel in the sermon on Sunday, and I explained a lot of that context there, but Ezekiel is living right through the Babylonian conquest, and much of his work is very vivid and ecstatic and wild, because quite frankly it was a very wild time. He is giving a whole host of very, when I say vivid, I mean very, very in-your-face demonstrations that God is using him essentially almost like a billboard, and he's embodying and actually living out the kind of symbolism that's being kind of pushed forward there. One of the things that comes forward is that he curses the corruption of the temple, Ezekiel I'm talking about here. And then what happens is that, and this is right just before the conquest is complete, the holiness of God, right, which the glory of God that dwells in the Holy of Holies in the old covenantal context, actually exits the temple, right, exits the Holy of Holies out the east gate, and goes and dwells and resides on the Mount of Olives in judgment over the city. And then Ezekiel condemns the temple, right? That's what Christ is actually doing there. He's replaying this action, not just the prophecy, but actually this action from God that God did there in Ezekiel's day. He's replaying it in the lead up to the Olivet Discourse. He, the glory of God, right? When we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, according to John chapter 1. He exits the temple to the east, goes over and moves over to the Mount of Olives, and then pronounces the destruction of the temple in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, which is exactly what played out in Ezekiel, right? So at this particular juncture, from that particular point, the glory of God, God's presence, God's dwelling, is no longer in the temple. So all the while we've been throughout the book of Acts, the glory of God is not in the temple. He's not dwelling in the temple. He's not connected to the temple. He has not been there. He has removed himself from it. He removed himself literally from it in Jesus' day. Right? This is all towards the fulfillment of 1,000 different things, kind of things that get picked up, of course, by Christ in his discourse with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. Kind of his first, one of the very first things he actually does in regards up there in Samaria, and speaks, of course, of how the days are coming and have indeed now come when God will not be worshipped on this mountain or on that mountain or this specific fixed place. But God is rather seeking those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. Right? This is him kind of, and the kind of language that then the apostles flesh out in their epistles regarding the people being the temple of God. Christ the cornerstone, the apostles the foundation, and then we being built up as living stones. Okay?
It's interesting that you talked about the word "and," but then you just said the kingdom of God is coming and has
now come. Exactly. That's part of the reference of what I'm making there in that he is using those things in conjunction and connection.
So they're a single item, which means not only is it here now, but it's going to be here for a long time. Yeah,
exactly. And that's the kind of play, no need to playing words, that's the kind of way in which that language is then constructed. Yeah, correct. And so that's why it's not a question of it being purely in the future. It's Christ brought it, and then that's why you then see all these parables of growth and expansion. Yeah. This temple has become exactly what Christ said it was, a den of thieves, right? A den of robbers, in other words. It has become the synagogue of Satan, and God is not worshipped in this temple. In fact, if Christ and the apostles are to be believed, which I would obviously very much argue they are, not only is God not worshipped here, Satan is. Right? It's not just that's not just a tongue-in-cheek kind of figure of speech. There's a host of symbolism behind it, but it is also a factual reference. Why would that be the case? Well, there's 1,000 reasons, but precisely because of the kind of ones that I'm referring to here. They claim to stand on the law. Meanwhile, as we see very evidently throughout the Gospels, 99% of the time they're concerned with just about everything but the law. Right? They are exorbitantly more concerned with their own man-made rabbinical traditions, their own teachings, their own interpretations, half of which are wild, at least in terms of how you should actually interpret Scripture. I've met second-year Bible college students who have a better ability to exegete and interpret the Scriptures than some of the kind of conclusions that the scribes and the Pharisees draw in the Gospels.
It's a cult. I mean, what you describe is everything you'd see
in many respects. Yeah, in many respects, yeah. Some of the retorts that they give to the words of Christ, apart from the general trickery of it, are just mind-boggling, especially to someone like me with academic background, because they do have an academic background in those days. Yeah, absolutely. Half the time when I read the Gospels, it's an interesting experience because I'm left somewhere between befuddled and outraged as to how they ever drew the conclusion that they drew, by virtue of the fact that that's really actually ends up being kind of the point as to why it's recorded. It's recorded for that point. Their concern for the careful, diligent, humble exposition of the Old Testament, of the law of God, is just non-existent. That's why I've said again, the traditions which have come back with them from Babylon, the traditions which they've merged with certain elements from the Hellenistic period in their days of the Seleucid Empire, but particularly that which they brought back from Babylon and kind of meshed together with a semblance of the law. That's what they then dwell and abide by. That's why they're infinitely more concerned, to the point of literal outrage, with Christ healing someone on the Sabbath, as opposed to the actual instance of someone actually being benefited on the Sabbath. Right? That's why they are infinitely more concerned with the Korban rule of how much, literally to the grain of cumin and the spices, are meant to be dedicated in the temple, as opposed to all of the poor and the downtrodden which are begging for help around the temple.
But also I think maybe by having like Jesus, heal people on the Sabbath, it brings glory to God.
Correct.
That ultimately, that's like, I would imagine, like that. Not only is it helping that person, of course it is, but it's
The primary purpose is to point to God. Yes, correct.
Yeah. And,
yep.
and they're critical of that. Like,
They are, yes. Well, that's why, and that's where the climax of their criticisms, and the text points this out. It's just kind of, it can get missed if you're kind of glossing through it. The climax of these criticisms is when they eventually accuse Jesus of being demon possessed, right? And so they're attributing the works of God to the works of demons.
Just a walk in the park in logic, and then says, well,
everything.
If that is true, then a house can't stand against itself. Is basically on it.
Yeah, that's where that comes from. It's exactly correct. Yes.
It just shows the stupidity of their accusation. No,
correct. Exactly. No, 100%. And I could go on all day about these kinds of concepts. Yeah, you're right. And so even the second, no matter what portion of verse 28 you're looking at here, the whole thing is corrupt. If Paul was actually against the Jews, which would be ironic because he himself is a Jew, but however that would work anyway. If he was so engrossed in self-loathing and hatred, which can happen to people, why would he be going around attempting to propagate among them the source of life and salvation? Even if you were to argue, and again, it's a hypothetical because that's not what's going on here, but I'm just using a logic for a sec. Even if you were to argue that what Paul was saying was incorrect and was erroneous, the most you could probably be, accuse him of would be being misguided, right? Even on the prima facie level, accusing him of being against the Jews, even though he's been traveling around half the eastern empire, eastern portions of the empire, trying desperately to bring salvation to people, even if that was just in his head. Is he really against the Jews when that's the very thing he's been trying to bring to them? Right? It doesn't make sense.
So the motivation of these people who have followed from Asia to him is because he's knocked out all their idol business.
Yeah, in many respects, yeah, there's that. But this is the deep. You're exactly. But that touches on the deepest, the kind of foundation of all of this. Paul has very much spoken against them. We've seen that, of course, right? He's spoken against their lies, against their twisting of the law, against their elevation of Babylonian trash above the law of God, etc., 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 like all the way down the list, right? So this is what I was saying about the irony, right? And this is the duplicity and the deception of it. When they say against our people and the law and this place, what they mean in reality is against our people and the law, the oral teachings, the oral traditions, the trash we brought back from Babylon, and this place, our corrupt temple. That's what ends up actually functionally being the meaning. Not in their heads, that's not what they mean in their heads. They think they're on God's side here. But in reality, what's going on here is that he actually is, in this foundational sense, speaking against our people, in other words, those who have rejected Christ and who murdered Christ, and against the law, and by law it means the oral traditions and the laws of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, not the law of God, and this place, this now godless temple, which has actually become the synagogue of Satan. It's the same as how, for example, in many, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar. How, for example, the most, and I'm much more careful about how this is why I teach people to do it this way. An issue that a Christian will come up against when they're conversing with someone, especially not just even broadly in the LGBT kind of lifestyle, but specifically and particularly those who are claiming to be transgender. When a Christian speaks against that and against that kind of sexual corruption, or against the fact that no, you can't become a female if you're a male, you can't become a male if you're a female, or whatever. The reason why that is taken with such a deeply brings about a deeply bitter and angry response very often, not always, but often, is because in the minds of those who propagate and live that way, this is not just a component, it's actually the fundamental component of their identity. Okay? I am gay. I am lesbian. I am transgender. It's why there's so much celebration, so much revelry. It's why there's so much attention and focus, all the way down to the nth degree of it. It mustn't just simply be acknowledged. It must be actively celebrated and endorsed and complied with. Because to them, it is the very essence of, it is the core and pillar of their identity. Everything else in their life is ultimately one way or another measured by that foundational pillar. Everything is referential, right? Especially when you're talking about those on the transgender side of the equation, which is a very deeply existential claim about who they are or are not in this case. And so to speak against it in their mind, in terms of how they perceive it, I'm referring to, is a direct assault on their very humanity. That's why there's such often a completely disproportionate reaction with regards to, say, for example, even now, you will have, because it's coming up to Mardi Gras, whenever that is in Sydney, you'll see online flurries of articles and petitions and everything else calling for more legislation to protect our very vulnerable community and the massive amount of hate crimes and attack. The entire, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I actually was listening to the radio the other day, and you can actually sponsor children through an organisation called Pinnacle
Yeah.
to transgender.
Yeah,
and to
gender affirming therapy. Yeah, and this is the point I'm trying to make. That level of disconnect between perception and reality of where we are the most oppressed and hated group in the West. Meanwhile, in reality, there are entire months, entire holidays, celebrations, parades, entire cities shut down, every single organisation, corporately, in the corporate sector, educational sector, public sector, whatever, full endorsement, celebrate. So the disconnection between the reality versus the perception of it. But all of that is coming because their entire filter of how they view literally the universe in which they live, their very worldview, is filtered through one defining factor. I am gay. I am lesbian. I am transgender, whatever the definition happens to be. And so it's a very similar thing to what's going on here. The filter through which they're perceiving Paul's actions versus the reality of what Paul's actually doing are two completely different things. Right? It's the same respect as to why I'm pointing that out. The perception of what's going on versus the reality of what's going on, where you're actually the most celebrated people group in all of the West, and our institutions in literal and figurative terms bow down before your ideological agenda and everything else that comes with it. That difference between perception and reality can often be immeasurable, and that's the kind of problem we're seeing here. Right? Their perception of what's going on, because of, in this case, the blindness that's caused by their worldview, that's why Paul refers to them as blind men. We even had that in the gospel reading in the liturgy on Sunday, right? Where he says those who are blind will see, right? Because those who are humble enough to recognize it, it's like the whole poor in spirit reference. Those who are blind, humble enough to recognize that they are spiritually blind will be given sight. But those who see, in other words, the self-righteous, will be blinded. Okay. The difference between their perception of what Paul's doing, what this whole scenario is, versus the reality is catastrophically impassable for them. They think we're the ones on God's side, we're on the right side of history, to use a modern term, we're with God, we're the ones defending his law, we're the ones protecting the temple. These are heretics who are rejecting God, who are destroying the religion, who are destroying our people, blah, 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 blah. The opposite is true. They're not with God. They're destroying the religion. They're condemning their people. That's what blindness does.
Interestingly enough, too, with you mentioned the various communities,
Sure.
and they're actually trying to fight being discriminated against. In actual fact, the irony is that they're actually doing it by discriminating against a lot of organisations and enforcing things against that organisation's even its own credo.
Oh, correct, exactly. Yes, the most oppressed, or the most oppressed people group in the West apparently has the ability to, in certain instances, effectually demand that that patently, blatantly, and obviously Christian schools, like chartered as such, must not fire people for not adhering to the doctrinal statement of the church, of that particular school, whichever church it's associated with, right? That's apparently what constitutes discrimination. Having the political and economic power to force Christian organizations into submission through basically just kind of lawfare, right? Just litigation warfare, right? Through suing them into oblivion, through wielding the levels of power in the police and in Justice Department and Department of Justice and so on and so forth. That apparently is what constitutes being discriminated and oppressed, right? And by the way, I know it's actually no, I won't point it out. I was going to say something that's not. No, I was going to say something that it's a caveat that doesn't need to be given. The caveat in certain scenarios is highlighting the fact that it doesn't come from a place of hatred. But I don't need to keep justifying that perspective because it would be obvious.
It's like saying we want to be free to practice what we think we should be able to practice, but you guys aren't free to practice what you want to practice.
Yeah, correct.
That's the irony, as what we're seeing here, and I'm just saying that there's an irony that seems to be consistent.
But that's the whole issue. Yeah, but that's the issue of that's the inherent nature of corruption.
It's even there's some sort of meeting at River Falls Lake or something, some sort of like mini Mardi Gras thing, but you can only go if you're basically on board. Like you can't. They said, oh, it's an inclusive event.
No, inclusiveness is much like the other lies that they tell, which is inclusiveness right up until the moment that becomes entirely inexpedient. Just like how, for example, if anyone's had the displeasure and misfortune of following the news lately,
with the police officer.
Yeah, correct. So there's two gentlemen, I don't remember names, it's not by design, I just can't remember what the names are. But anyway, there were two gentlemen who were murdered by a police officer in basically this kind of gay lovers spat. And long story short, blah blah, they found bodies and the kind of investigation is playing out. Point being, they found him in a dam down near kind of near Canberra, yeah, somewhere. Anyway, point being I'm making is not so much that. The point I'm making is that then the New South Wales Police on an institutional level have then been banned from the Mardi Gras thing coming up, right?
Because it's a bad look.
Because of the actions of one single individual, right? And this is not me saying, oh no, they should be like. I'm saying it's a good thing because it points out the absolute and utter hypocrisy of these people, right? Inclusiveness, diversity, tolerance, inclusiveness. Get out of our parade. You're not welcome here, right? It's just the hypocrisy of then completely discluding, unincluding, uninviting everything else in between, because that's exactly because that's my whole point. Is that self-righteousness in people can only maintain that facade for so long. Eventually, the actual vices of such people, the pride, the arrogance, the blindness, eventually can't help but kind of crawl up to the surface. I'm making those points not for those points. I'm using those to compare and to understand what we're looking at here. Their blindness and their hypocrisy, especially in regards to the law. And again, I don't want to, because it comes up in chapter 23 particularly and specifically. But these people here who are touting about their supposed allegiance to the law of God, their supposed allegiance to Scripture, the fact that they're on the right side of this thing and they're with God and they're with the law and blah blah blah, are then going to, in 2 chapters' time, spend the entire chapter absolutely flaunting almost every aspect of that law in how they then treat Paul.
would it be safe also to say that they are also a big part of that is fighting for their lifestyle, what they've built for themselves, their credibility in the community, they see.
In some respect, yeah. I mean, look, one of the fundamental theological, it's not the only one. There's 1,000, but one of the theological errors of their time and of these people here, of the Jews who rejected the Messiah, is their erroneous understanding of the nature of the kingdom. They had the timing correct, but the nature of it was the problem that was incorrect. They knew full well, I would argue, what many of the prophecies were. They knew, for example, what Daniel had said about the coming of the Messiah and about the coming of the kingdom. They knew full well that Daniel essentially dates it to the year, and that date runs us all the way through, shock horror, to the crucifixion of Christ. Now, if you needed more evidence, you have a guy 490 years, well, more than that for him, but he's talking about from a certain juncture, the command to rebuild the temple, which came down in the 5th century. From that point forward, there would be 490 years between that moment in which the Persian emperor would command the rebuilding of the temple, this very temple, and the time in which the prince that was to come, the Messiah, would be cut off. Right? So in other words, talking about the crucifixion. What ultimately was his death and then his burial and resurrection. And that's timed all the way down. And again, this all coordinates all exactly to the point in which Christ was crucified.
They're still fighting against, fighting, I don't think it's the right word, trying to help people who still, to this day, don't have an understanding of the kingdom of God. And, you know,
yeah, well, yeah, it's exactly, it's a diverse, there are diverse opinions on it, of course. But part of the fundamental premise is that when you then, the Old and New Testament have a lot to say about this concept of the kingdom, but of course, almost everything that Christ was talking about was about this kingdom. And every single bit of rhetoric is him explaining that the kingdom has come with him. Vis-a-vis one of the passages I mentioned earlier, the time is coming and indeed has now come.
See, a lot of people think it's heaven.
Repent, yeah, it's not just, no. It's the unification of heaven and earth. That's what we see play out. That's why we see it play out that way symbolically in the book of Revelation, but that's a whole other subject. That's why we, of course, pray, is that we're not praying for something. When we pray the Lord's Prayer, that thy will would be done, so that thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're not talking about something strictly in the future. We're praying the same prayer that Christians have been praying since Christ first said those words. When we see all the various images and parables that Christ gives, they're all of something starting small and then growing and filling the whole world. They're never just monolithic, not here yet, boom, now it's entirely here. There's a growth and a succession.
There's a growth aspect to it, though, isn't it?
Yeah, the mustard seed, the rock that grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth, etc., etc., etc.
And it could be just boom. I mean, it's in his power to do it.
No, exactly, but it's no different than why did God, because this is interesting, and I'll draw this concept here before we move on. In our time, much of the debate concerning the early chapters of Genesis are concerning differences between, differences of opinion concerning the definition of what those days constitute, what they mean, what they look like, etc. Many things that could be said about that, which would take up too much time. Ironically, at different points in church history, especially in the early church, much of the discussion was actually on the opposite end. It was actually over why did God take 6 days at all, as opposed to
like that, which is good. Yeah.
Because of process. Because of process. Because Genesis 1, irrespective of anyone's opinions, and I'm not even proffering mine here at this point, but is not a scientific textbook, and that portion's not up for debate. It's also not up for debate as to whether or not scientific conclusions, modern scientific conclusions, were even in the mind of Moses or of anyone else reading that book. That's not up for debate either, because the obvious answer is no. And none of that precludes Genesis 1 through 11 from being historical. None of that precludes it from being infallible. None of that precludes it from being any of those things, which I do actually affirm. but that's the balance of things. Is
But
that
I mean, the growth of the kingdom of God is also procedural. As
yes, just as
was.
creation was, for the purpose of ordering this primordial chaos that was created first. Yes, and showing demonstration of the very same dominion which he then commands to humanity to undertake, to be fruitful and multiply, etc.
It also have to do with what you've talked about before, about, because that's always stuck with me, the idea that God is a God of order, not chaos, and the fact that there's this system to things, and that things are, the creation happened as just as he planned it, and it's very, when you read it, it's beautiful, it's lovely to read, and it's kind of like every step is like divinely inspired. I don't know how to say it, but it's kind of like
meticulously ordered.
Yeah, it's ordered. Yeah,
And engineered and built. And
correct.
Yeah, and it's broken down so that us plebby people can actually at least get some understanding of that grandeur. Each little step, isn't that little? Because if it was all happened like that, it would just blow. Like I don't know that we would.
No, there's there's 1,000 reasons for it. Yeah, part of it is the polemic of, and so polemic, referring to giving a defence of, or providing a counter argument to. It's a polemic against especially chapter 1, but elsewhere I suppose it's a polemic against the contemporary pagan cosmologies and cosmogonies and mythologies of that time, of the ancient Near East, 3,500 years ago and before, nearly 4,000 years ago. It's a polemic against that, where, as I've explained many times in sermons and whatnot before, where the gods actually come forth from the primordial chaos itself, whereas here God actually creates that very chaos and then orders it, so it's a complete inverse and opposite. That's a fundamental reason for its writing, but it's not just it was written that way but didn't happen that way. No, it happened that way and then was recorded as such to demonstrate that fact, right? So it's not like it was just written as purely a polemic, but that's not actually how it played out. That would be an incorrect understanding. No, God actually did it that way, and then Genesis is recorded by Moses, probably drawing from earlier sources and stories and tradition and the oral traditions, but that's a whole other show together. And his account is recounted as a polemic against the prevailing mythologies and cosmogonies of particularly Babylon and Egypt and elsewhere. Yeah.
So just on a side issue that God is a God of order, he's also pointing out that, well, yes, I am of order, but there's still things you need to find out. Dark matter, dark energy.
Oh, sure, of learning, yeah, sure.
Pauli's principle of the electron conveyances.
Well, that's partly why, and this point I definitely will finish on because we can get down a rabbit hole. That's why mathematical and scientific things are described as being,
This is all stuff we know it's ordered, we just don't know why and how.
Or the how thing, yeah. That's why scientific and particularly mathematical theorems are described as being discovered, not invented. For anyone unfamiliar.
It's like the creator's just waiting. Wait till you find this one.
So Pythagorean theorem is described as being discovered by Pythagoras, not invented, right? These mathematical truths exist, to use a very simple form, this many combined with this many equaling this many, whether I call it 4, whether I say it out loud. Here I'm using fingers to describe it. I could use 4 sticks on the ground. Binary. I could use binary. I could draw a number 4 in the English script version of Arabic. All of that is just the material manifestation or the material representation, to use a more specific word, of the abstract reality that this many and this many equals this many, right? That exists independent of our minds. It exists independently of people, of our consciousness. Every human being could die right now. And not just every human being, every single life form on the earth could be wiped out right now. And this many and this many would still equal this many.
Yeah, good gamma ray burst from a supernova, that'll do it.
Yeah, is that these all point to the objective nature of reality. And also, without diving too heavily into metaphysics, which is kind of my wheelhouse, if they exist independently of our mind, but they're also abstract, it must mean that they are existing within another mind.
Ooh.
That sounds like serious.
Now, there's also how do we know we're not just some
That's the atheistic,
recreation
yeah.
of a game of somebody
Yeah.
else's mind.
Yeah,
Including
that's the endless atheistic rabbit holes they have to go down to avoid the obvious reality staring them in the face. Is that the God that they don't want to submit to is actually there.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they don't exist, if these abstract concepts are independent of our minds, which they are objectively, but they're also abstract, so they're not material, they must exist within some other mind, that mind being God. But anyway, let's go back to this. So lies upon lies upon lies, including even the point being drawn in verse 29, that they'd seen, that in reality what happened is they'd seen one of Paul's Greek companions, Trophimus of Ephesus, or Trophimus the Ephesian, in the city with him, and they'd blindly assumed that he'd been in the temple. So even their basis for the accusation was a lie anyway. So the people who care so much about the law, like that one against bearing false witness, that tiny little insignificant command that happens to sneak its way into the Ten Commandments, they obviously don't care that much about the law.
Oh, that's used so much even today. Nobody cares about it,
But this is my point.
Ruin someone's reputation.
No, yeah, this is to my point, is that the people in the very sentence in which they're accusing him of being an enemy of the law, they're
breaking it.
They then tap dance right over the top of the law.
Yeah.
They're hypocrites. As to be expected, unfortunately. So in verse 30, then all the city was stirred and the people rushed together. A riot ensued, again, at the hands of the Jews from Asia, who started a riot in...
How many people would that be at the time of Pentecost? That'd be, millions?
Yeah, at least a million at the bare minimum. Probably anywhere from 1 million to 3 million is
leaves January 6th in the dust, doesn't it?
Well, it leaves anything in the dust. Yeah, we wouldn't seen a riot like this. Yeah, this is not. I mean, how many in the temple here right now? But this is not a tiny crowd. We saw that it was a massive crowd in Ephesus, and it would be an even bigger crowd here, right? And right in the middle of in the heart of the city too, in the temple. This is, I mean.
No wonder the Romans decided to step in here and now.
Yeah, well, that's part of the actions, and part of this is then reading some of the context in a story form as well, because again, the blunt wording can sometimes not illuminate to us the point if we're not used to reading narrative literature. So then all the city was stirred, right, and the people rushed together, taking hold of Paul, and they dragged him out of the temple. Again, so this is not like we're not in a museum here. They physically grab him and they're dragging him on the ground and presumably beating the living daylights out at the same time. I'm not saying that's speculative. It's because of information that comes later.
So where's
dragged him out of the temple and immediately the doors were shut.
Friends?
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Yeah,
Was
where's
James
his friends?
and all the...
Not just
Well,
them, but also
we don't know.
all the Jewish Christians, which would have been sprinkled throughout the crowd as well, throughout the city. I mean,
We don't. Well, look, he's as far as the text is concerned, it appears that he's by himself.
Where's the Judean suicide squad and the suicide squad of Judah?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, the point. Yeah, the text. No, I'm with you. The text is largely indicating that he's probably by himself.
Wow.
Noticing him in the temple, they don't notice anyone else. And it's also, by the way, that there's no indication that Trophimus the Ephesian is here either. They only make reference to, and we saw him, and he even brought Greeks into the temple, past tense. In the aorist tense, what it would be called here in Greek, past tense. They're not speaking of him being in the temple right now with those Greeks. They say he brought him in, as in like they're referring to a previous event in the previous week. That's what they're referring to. So the inference here is Paul's actually by himself in the temple, which is an interesting move. But anyway.
And what happened to the 4 men that had shaved their heads that he was supposed to be with at that instant?
Well, this is not that time period. So verse 27 indicates this is a week later.
It was the end, wasn't
Now,
it?
when the 7 days were almost over,
Yeah, that's right.
that's what I'm saying to you. Yeah, so we've jumped. That's what I highlighted at the beginning. We've jumped forward a week, so it's not. That's why I'm confident.
He's by himself.
That's why I'm confident he's by himself here, because this is not a follow-on. Because you could think if verse 27 was there, we ended in verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying them along with himself, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification, until the sacrifice was offered.
So it's just so be a little simple reporting back to the priests. We finished the sacrifice.
That happened in the temple, but then again, the interim of verse 27, now when the 7 days were almost, again, they're talking about a week later.
Yeah.
Almost, probably 6 days later, but
It
whatever.
was supposed to be just a simple task to do. He didn't need anybody along.
Well, whatever he's doing here, either way, he's in the temple complex, point being. probably actually preaching, which is the very impetus, because again, half his reason was he wanted to get back to Jerusalem for Pentecost for that very purpose. So he's actually probably preaching in the temple here. That's probably what's going on. Which in other words, functionally speaking, means that he's wearing a sandwich board saying, "Please shoot me." So
that's like Die Hard too.
yeah, I suppose, yes. And so so verse 31, and while they were seeking to kill him, upholding the law and all that, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort, to the Heliarchos. This is where a bit of historical understanding comes into play, so to help you see who some of these characters are in the story. So this is where I'm not going to overburden you with this, but I'll give you a basic lesson in how the Roman army was structured. During the Republican era of Rome, 509 BC down to about 27 BC, that roughly 500-year period of the Republic, for most of that time period, the comparative unit to what today we would call a company in the military was a centuria, and headed by a centurion. That's why we see that term. So that's where we get the definition of 100 from. That's why we refer to it as a century, right? Later on, though, during some of the military reforms brought in through Julius Caesar, through Augustus, and through a couple others here and there, a century by this time in the imperial period was actually down to about 80, ironically. So a century wasn't actually 100 at this time, it was about 80 guys. But anyway, point being that a century was commanded by a centurion. That soldier had been in the army for at least 10 years, and a cohort, which would be roughly speaking about 500. I'm again using round numbers because it depends on what time of the empire or the republic we're talking about here.
Basic garrison size, wasn't it?
More or less functionally, yeah. Again, that depends on where we're talking about, but I'm speaking in broad generalities here, yeah. You would have, go ahead.
There's a great series of YouTube videos on the structure of the Roman army and how they marched and what they set out on down the sides as well.
Yep.
They didn't just boldly walk down the road.
No, the Roman roads were designed they had clearings on each side to allow the army to march down them, yeah.
Well, they had scouts running ahead and to the sides as well, so they weren't in the bush.
And so a cohort, generally speaking, was 5 centuries. Again, in the old numbers, that would be 500. Again, by this imperial period, it's obviously less because the century is now 80 guys. And then a legion was then 10 cohorts, in other words, 10 groups of 500, or its adjusted imperial number, okay? So a cohort, 5 centuries, and then a legion, right, so the famous Roman legions, were then 10 cohorts.
That was their standard army. They take places, was it?
Yeah, and there were, by the height of the empire, there were over 20 legions around the empire.
Can I just ask, just to clarify, because in verse 31, mine actually doesn't say centurion, it says word came to the tribune.
Yep, so that's what I'm going to explain. Yes, so this is the commander. Yep, no, you're right. So this is not a centurion. I'm just referring to centurions in general, and just explaining some of the details. So no, this is not a centurion. This is a higher-ranking officer.
Favoured politician is a tribune.
Yeah, he's on his way to being a politician. Not a politician yet, but so then a legion, again, using the old numbers just to keep it simple because they were around. Century being 100, a cohort being 500. So in other words, 5 centuries. And then a legion being a legion being 10 cohorts, in other words, 5,000 troops. Again, those numbers fluctuate between the Republican and the Imperial period. And then even within the Imperial period, what we call the Principate and the Dominate, so in other words, the early empire, the late empire.
They at one stage had trouble populating their armies at one stage.
Well, they always had those issues because the territories in which they conquered far often outpaced the ability to actually manage them, and so the Roman army was always heavily dependent on auxilio, in other words, auxiliaries. Assimilating native armies into the Roman army as auxiliaries, and so they'd often be fighting alongside, Thracians and Germans and Gauls.
Which was one of the sources of their ability to spread so far, because they did use auxiliary.
Yes, the conquered armies would then be incorporated one way or another into the army.
And the wagon trains and the things that they used to carry all their supplies with. Yep. It was like it was an instant army camp wherever they stopped.
Yes, exactly, and the empire was measured by those. So you're asking, so you'll in verse 31, you'll either have commander of the Roman cohort or a tribune of the Roman cohort, generally being what the translation is there. So again, they're equivalent, broadly speaking, to our modern battalion. A cohort is, at least theoretically, in structure.
Regiment? What's it?
Regiment, yeah, a bit of a looser translation, but yes, you could argue that. So the cohort is what it was, is how we often translate it out of the Latin, and its Greek equivalents. But yeah, so the point being here is, who is this commander? So he's what we refer to as a tribune, and this is where I'm getting the crux of trying to explain to you, because this informs the context, right? So a single legion would have ultimately 6 tribunes, right? So not just the cohort, I'm talking about the entire legion, okay? Would have 6 tribunes. It would have a senior tribune and then 5 junior tribunes, right? I say that just in terms of rank or precedent.
This is all the stuff they explain in this YouTube too. It's really
That's not, that's not surprising. And so, anyway, so yes, a senior tribune, the primus pilus, and then 5 junior. But here's why by pointing this out. Tribunes were young officers, usually, roughly speaking, about the age of 20 plus or minus, right? Keeping in mind that their concepts of what constituted adulthood or manhood were much younger than our age of 18. But nevertheless, this was a young man. This guy wasn't 30 or 40. And he would be from a wealthy and senatorial gens, or family, in other words. His time as a tribune in the army, as a senior officer, essentially, would be the pathway or the pipeline for him then eventually entering into the Roman Senate. Okay, so this was part of the political pipeline. To give Rome an element of credit, their politicians had to have served in the Roman army. A concept which might actually do us benefit if we were to bring that back. But anyway,
well, it's still favoured in the American Senate
yeah, to a degree. So not so much these days, only by virtue of the politicking and the viewpoints that, generally speaking.
I'm just saying historically.
Oh, sure, historically, yes, sure. Yes,
and
sure.
also, historically, you had to actually have active service to be promoted in the armed forces of the US.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, well, that's part of the tradition. Yeah, exactly. And so he here is almost certainly not the primus pilus. He's probably one of the junior tribunes. But anyway, point being, he's a tribune nevertheless. He's a high-ranking officer in the entire, not just the cohort, but the legion.
Wow.
And so the Greek term chiliarchos means the commander of 1,000. That's the nearest equivalent. That's the term that would have been used in the Macedonian army of Alexander, for example. So that's why the Greek term is that way. But long story short, this individual in the Roman army is a tribune. He's probably 20 plus or minus. But a high rank. He's a senior officer. And holds massive command and authority, right? Which is why he's in Jerusalem, all right? Outside of Caesarea Maritima, which is the kind of administrative capital of the Roman province of Judea. It's the provincial capital in that respect. Jerusalem is its most important city.
It just looks like he hasn't really leveraged the whole strength of the Roman garrison that he's got.
No, well, they get caught off guard here, and they're on their heels from the get-go, to be fair. So while the Jews were seeking to kill him, so they've dragged him to the temple and they're beating him and probably attempting to try and stone him to death, without trial, by the way. So again, that whole concept of the people who are such sticklers for the law actually not even bothering to go to the effort of a trial. Hey, you got any witnesses for those claims? You know those multiple lines of independent evidence that you're supposed to have according to the law of God? You know those multiple witnesses? Or are we just going to drag him out because some Jews from Asia decided that he supposedly was doing X, Y, and Z, and that he allegedly brought a Greek into the temple, even though you have no evidence that happened, and we're just going to stone him right here and now? You know, those guys who care for the law? Right. Yeah, I'm not being sarcastic, except for the parts where I am. So while they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the tribune of the Roman cohort, who was probably who would have been the most senior official of this legion, in this part of Judea, or probably anywhere in Judea actually. Anyway, but certainly at least in Jerusalem, that all Jerusalem was in confusion, right? Chaos had erupted in the temple, as it were. Verse 32, and at once he took along soldiers and centurions, right? That's why I mentioned the centurions earlier. So he takes legionnaires, regular light infantrymen, or the soldiers, as well as their commanders with him. He's mobilizing the garrison. In other words, that's what's being referenced here. He's mobilizing the garrison.
What he can.
Yeah, based at the Antoninian fortress, which is where they were stationed in Jerusalem, right near the temple.
The centurions would have been very hardened soldiers. They wouldn't have blinked twice.
No, yeah, correct. The centurion is, unlike the tribune. The tribune has essentially gone straight into the position of tribune. It's a bit more complex than that, but that's I'm just oversimplifying it probably actually. Anyway, because it's part of the political pipe, it's senior, it's senior officer, it's senior commissioned, as we'd say these days. Anyway, the centurion though actually starts off as what today we would call a non-commissioned or an enlisted guy. He starts off as just your regular legionnaire, light infantry, and then he's been in for at least 10 years into a 25-year career, which is what that is. The Roman army was not like what we have today, where you have, depending on what job description, a four-year contract, 6-year contract, whatever it is.
Depending which service you did.
Yeah, you were in that for 25 years, or you're in that for nothing. No. And then if you made it to the 25 years, you got a pretty swell retirement plan actually. You got a plot of land on a farm somewhere, and you got household servants and a whole host of other things. And
you're not allowed to marry either, was that right?
it depends on what time we're talking about. Yeah, again, policies and different reforms, different points, Caesarean reforms, Marian reforms, etc. There are different reforms that take place in Roman imperial policy concerning the military, and so it's like with what's the size of a cohort? Well, it depends on what time we're talking about. Yeah. At once he took the soldiers and the centurions and ran down to them to the temple complex. And when they saw the commander, when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul.
Yeah, I'd stop with the single centurion, like, oh, okay, sorry.
But this is again part of the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
But if you guys were all doing this by the book and according to the law, why'd you stop? Because this is all you're doing is upholding the law, right? This is all lawful, except it's not lawful. No trial, no witnesses. No Levitical priest presiding as a judge, nothing, right? They're hypocrites, they're liars, they're deceivers. They're not with the law at all. They hate the law.
They're trouble raisers. They're stern.
Yeah, no, exactly. They hate the law, and that's why Christ and the apostles refer to them as the synagogue of Satan. So verse 33. Then the commander, the tribune, in other words, came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound up with 2 chains, and he began asking who he was and what he had done.
Why 2 chains?
Hands and feet.
Okay.
What?
Hands and feet.
Oh, sorry.
Yep, hands and feet. They're binding, again, the rest of that verse indicates why they're doing this. He began, as in the tribune, began to ask him who he was and what he had done. They're detaining him in order to be able to figure out what's going on. Because keep in mind, this whole premise is they've heard this chaotic riot erupt just across the way from them in the temple, because they've been the Antoninian fortress. And so they've heard this riot erupt not that far away from them. There's a distance, but it's not that far. And so they're scrambling to mobilize to get to the temple complex, and they arrive there and they see, we're not told how many, but a gigantic horde of Jews beating the living daylights out of Paul and attempting to kill him. They're probably already trying to stone him. They're beating him to a pulp, blah, blah, blah. And so then they're going to secure him. They've detained him, and then they're trying to now investigate and figure out what on earth's going on. So I'm trying to be reasonable with these Roman soldiers here. It's no different than how when police arrive on scene in our context here, handcuffing someone, detaining them, they haven't been arrested yet, but detaining them in handcuffs is not only for the officer's safety, it's also for the safety of anyone else around that scenario while they're trying to figure out what on earth's going on here. Because 99% of the time, police officers, when they roll up on a particular scene, if it's a crime scene, or irrespective of whether it's a crime scene or not, have usually very limited and scantily clad information that gives them basically no context. All they know is whatever the dispatcher has told them from the hysterical voice coming at them over the phone about something blah 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 at my house, something blah 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 blah, gun blah blah blah,
Yeah.
he's hurt, and that's congrats, that's all we know, right? And so you have no idea what you're rolling into, right? So it's the same premise here.
Try to separate people too, all the participants.
Yeah, people who don't exactly. So people who don't understand how police work often works don't quite see. They get up, into an uproar when someone gets put in handcuffs. No, handcuffs are for everyone's safety, including the officers. So that's what they're doing here. I'm trying to be reasonable with these Roman soldiers. And so in verse 34, but among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another, because of course they are, because it's a riot and it's chaos, and so they're not even giving a coherent reason as to why they're doing what they're doing. But that's the whole nature of what a mob does, right? Why are we taking X action? Well, you're going to get different reasons from different people because they're all whipped into a frenzy. It's the hive mentality of what happens when human beings get into large crowds often, is that the logical faculties of their brain just disintegrate within their skulls, and they can't do anything other than just literally go with the flow of the tide of the crowd.
In the crowd, humans are dumber than sheep.
Yeah, correct. Yep, and that's an insult to the sheep. And so yes, so they've been given different reasons. Verse 34, one reason, another, and when they could not find out the facts because of the uproar, so they can't. So they had no way of determining what was happening, why it was happening, what was the reason for this. No one. It's just absolute chaos, literal chaos. That's what's meant by Luke's word confusion in these previous verses. Yeah, so when they're shouting one thing another, blah, 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 and the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought back to the barracks. So they decide to transport him to the barracks, to the Antoninian fortress, and so that they can then sort it out, hopefully, without being surrounded by a mob as they're trying to investigate what on earth's gone on. And when he got to the stairs, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence. So he has been gravely, gravely wounded by this, right? He has been... just like in Derbe, just like elsewhere.
He's got his feet.
That's about what I was about to say.
How's he, what's he jumping along? I mean,
Yeah.
how's he getting along anyway?
Yeah, well, that's it, shuffling along as you can think of someone in ball and chain type of figure. But he can't even get up the stair. Those chains. Well, that would be normal anyway. But chains have enough room to be able to mobilise up a stairs. It just means if you attempt to run, you're going to fall. You're going to face plant in the dirt. That's what chains. Chains around the feet are designed to be able to stop you from running away. They're designed for you to be able to move at the walking shuffle pace, and as soon as you try to run and get a stride out, you're going to trip over and fall and face plant.
Prison chains they put around.
It's the same thing, yeah, exactly. You can climb up, so it's the same as how someone in prison chains around their feet can get into a bus to get transported, right? They come up the stairs into the bus. You can come up the stairs, you can move your feet, but you just can't run. And so as soon as you start to try and stride and running and fall over. But he can't even make it up the stairs because he's been so badly beaten. And so they actually have to... That's why Luke explains why. He was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. No. Paul's not a spring chicken either here at this age.
I was wondering how old he was.
Yeah, maybe 50 plus or minus probably. Yeah. That old. The point being is that he's not young like Barnabas was when Barnabas was with him. So he's been gravely beaten here. This is just like Derbe.
But the people actually follow them into the barracks.
They're trying to. Yeah.
But that's
verse 36 says, "For the multitude of the people kept following them, shouting away with him."
But following soldiers into a barracks is for certain going to be some sort of really bad punishment,
That's a right, though. That's a right. I'm saying to you, cognitive faculties, logic, rationality, civility, temperance of thought, even just making the assessment of, hey, we probably shouldn't try and storm the steps of the Antoninian fortress and
it's
at the back.
Today, walking on, trying to force your way onto a modern army military base.
Yeah, but that's
will shoot you.
Yeah, but that's what happens with riots. Yeah, that's what happens with. This is the demonic kind of element of it. This is what lies do. It's what I'm trying to point out. Like, it's not. This is part of the human condition. That you then see play out over and over and over again. This is what happens in riots. This is what happens when a crowd is whipped up into a frenzy based on lies. right? This entire thing is started purely off of lies and hypocrisy. Nothing but utter deception by the people who are claiming blasphemously and ironically to be on God's side and on the side of the law, right? And so they kept following them, shouting away, right? And so then verse 37, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek?" Right? When he said, again, this is my point about reading between the lines, understanding the context. When Paul says, "May I say something to you?" I'm getting it up here.
Must have said it in Greek.
Yeah, when he does, he says it in Greek. When Paul says, "Exestin moi epin ti proste," to him in, as I just said it in Greek, right? Trying to keep an Aussie accent while doing it.
Aussie Greek.
Yeah. When he says that to him, he turns at him shocked and surprised and says, "You know Greek," right? That's it's a surprise that the tribune has, right? He's surprised he knows Greek.
Because he's just not a local scallywag. He's actually
no, and he explains probably what they decided, they'd probably started to try and draw a conclusion as to who they thought this was.
Yeah.
And that's what it's explained in verse 38, 39. So verse 38, this is him continuing to speak. So he said, "Do you know Greek? Then you're not the Egyptian who some time ago raised a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness." Right? He's referring to the assassins, the Sicarii. We've covered them in church history in some of when we were talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish-Roman War of AD 66 to AD 73. The Zealots, who were violent, revolutionary, paramilitary group among the Jews, who have been operating for decades by this point, and who become one of the driving forces in the war that is about to take place in about a decade. Another one of their contemporaries, who were very much like the Zealots and sometimes often are held together with the Zealots, but technically were a distinct group, the Sicarii, Sicarii in Latin. Sicarii means, in a literal sense in Latin, means dagger or dagger wielder, the one who wields a dagger. Comes from a Latin root word sicae, S-I-C-A-E, which means dagger. So the Sicarii were we translated as assassins here, and rightfully so. I'll explain some of the context. The Sicarii were, like the Zealots, violent paramilitary group of Jews in Judea and elsewhere, but primarily in Judea, who became known as such because they were essentially as I mentioned, a paramilitary organization that conducted assassinations, assassinating Roman officials, assassinating Roman citizens even, making virtually no distinction between whether someone was armed or not armed or anything else in between. They would assassinate political figures, they would assassinate Jews who they considered to be traitors in relation to Rome, blah, blah, blah. They were bloodthirsty mongrels, quite frankly, but anyway.
So why was the assumption that they could not speak Greek then?
So they would speak, so as I've pointed out in times past, but it's worth refreshing on. The common misconception is that the Jews are speaking Hebrew at this time. They're not. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, and by extension the Levites, right, the priesthood, they're using Hebrew in certain contexts in regards to the temple and the synagogues, depending where you are, of course. But anyway, the common language of the Jews at this time is Aramaic, not Hebrew. Hebrew is functionally dead in terms of public usage, at least. They're speaking Aramaic and the Western dialect of that, generally speaking, as well. Jews who are still living in Babylon would use Aramaic also, the Eastern dialect. But anyway, point being, they're using Aramaic and they speak Aramaic. So that's why when throughout the Gospels, Jesus is only really ever speaking Aramaic or Greek. There's no real instance in which he's ever speaking Hebrew, even really to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so the Sicarii would speak Aramaic, obviously, as would the Zealots, as would many of the others. And he's referring to a revolt which did occur about 3 years prior at this time. We won't dive deeply into the history, but this is recorded elsewhere by Josephus, who was a first century historian alive at the time. There's a major revolt that occurs down in Egypt, led by an Egyptian Sicario, or member of the Sicarii. And that's what this tribune's making reference to, this event which was recorded historically by Josephus. And that man apparently was still at large and wanted, obviously.
And unable to speak Greek, I guess.
Yeah, unable to speak Greek. No, he would have spoken Aramaic, you presume. And so then a Roman soldier would be surprised anyway if they ever heard a Jew speaking Greek in this part of the empire, because
And Paul chose to speak Greek. He did that strategically.
well, because the Romans speak Greek.
Yeah.
They all speak Greek.
But they also understand Aramaic. He could have said the same thing in Aramaic, and they would have just said, nah.
This tribune.
Because he was asking questions from people.
Yeah, look, he would speak. He would have the ranges of who spoke what. Certainly in his position, he would know Aramaic because he'd need to, in reference to talking with officials and a whole host of other kind of political things like that. Yeah, but primarily, though, of course, the Romans are speaking Greek or Latin, but whatever.
They were speaking Latin.
Well, it depends where they're from. So we've seen, for example, we've only really encountered one, at least by noteworthiness, we've only encountered one actual Roman or Latin in Cornelius back in chapter 10. He is part of the Italic cohort of that legion. So he is a Roman from Rome. He is Italic or Latin. He's an Italian, if I think of it in modern parlance. He's a Latin. And so
the rest of the army would have had to speak the universal language of Greek just to talk to each other.
Well, yes, and the vast majority of Roman soldiers were not Latins either. They were, as I'd mentioned, they were from all around the empire, and that's not even including the auxiliaries, right? Who were the conquered, who then were assumed into the army as auxiliaries. So he's shocked that he's speaking Greek, and so then he then realizes, oh, you're not. Because that's probably what they were. As they're transporting him back to the barracks, they're probably trying to figure out, maybe he's the leader of the Sicarii from Egypt that we've been looking for. But
overheard them go, no, I'll tell you in Greek so you know.
Yeah, correct. That's probably the impetus, right? Okay. And so, the Sicarii were ruthless, utterly ruthless. All part of the broader attempt in the first century to overthrow the Romans and to establish the kingdom of God in their own image, basically. To a whole point again, they understood the timing of the kingdom; they didn't understand its nature. This is the whole, and I'll wait till the end to make this point, but. They misidentify. They then, this is him figuring out, as in the Tribune, figuring out that that's not this figure who they're looking towards, and I'll talk more about it in a minute. But Paul said, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city, and I beg you, allow me to speak to the people." Now, he's listening. He also misses a very key phrase, which is what's going to come up in the next chapter. Paul tells him here that he's a citizen.
So is he a Roman?
Well, he's a Roman. So he's a Jew ethnically. Yeah. He's born and raised mixed Jewish Greek culturally. He's also a Roman citizen, right? Part of the reason why Christ chose him. He has the ability to.
And that particular.
No, he misses that.
And you're
going to see that come. I'm not going to comment on it now because it comes from the next chapter, but you'll see it in the next chapter, and then I'll remind you of what. He misses the fact that Paul tells him that he's a citizen. Okay, and that's going to become, that makes no sense to us now, but in the next chapter you're going to see why that's important.
It's got extra privileges, let's put it that way.
Yeah, on how they're to be treated. And so we're going to see that in the next chapter. I'll save it for then. This is setting us up for then what is the next chapter. So the next chapter, almost the entirety of it basically, is then the Romans dealing with Paul, and then the chapter after it, 23, is then Paul handed over by the Romans to the Jewish Sanhedrin, or the Jewish Council. Very reminiscent of how the order of events played out with another particular figure that may or may not have happened in the Gospels, of being brought before a particular Roman official and then handed over to the Jewish Sanhedrin. Anyway,
it's too much of a hot potato. Let's let them handle it.
Well, yeah, the context of which will become illuminated to us in the next two chapters. Okay, and part of it is going to be, I point out this thing about the citizen. Because you're about to see, you're about to see over the next two chapters how the apostate Jews of this day are categorically being shown by Luke as the author to be orders of magnitude worse than the very people who are described as being part of this beast called Rome. The next chapter is going to play out and show you how the Romans, broadly speaking, dealt openly and fairly with Paul, and then you're going to see how the very opposite of that happens when he handed over to the Jews. But anyway, that essentially ends what we're looking at today. As I said, a lot of that context is going to become apparent next week, and the week after, and the week after. But nevertheless, that's where we are. Right? Violent mob, all based on lies, entirely based on lies, like lies that aren't even internally consistent, and not even just internally consistent. One sentence, which is then completely obliterated by the very next sentence that comes out of their mouth. About he's teaching everyone everywhere to be against the law, and then they tell a blatant lie in the very next sentence, in complete violation of that law, about the one who supposedly is teaching people against the law. Right? It's just utter corruption. But again, a brood of vipers or a pit of vipers, den of thieves. Whitewashed tombs with filled with dead men's bones.
And that insults all those descriptions because they're far worse than that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the ultimate. Look, I suppose it's probably nothing worse than being called the synagogue of Satan, but point being. And again, these are all, it's fundamentally based on, they lie within their own description. He's even brought Greeks in the temple. No evidence that they'd done that. All they had done is seen Trophimus in the city.
And you said it as an insignificant accusation because there's a part of the temple that they can freely walk through.
Yeah, correct. And even if, again, as I'm saying, even if he was in the temple, that's the whole point of the outer court. And even if he was in the inner court, the whole point of the outer temple is designed to symbolically show the influx of the nations into the inner court. That's the whole prophetic demand. But that's the issue, though, is that their definition of how they wanted the kingdom, again, right timing, wrong nature. Their understanding of what the king, they'd completely, this is my whole point about the teachings and the law and supposedly being on God's side. They wanted a kingdom without the actual king. They wanted a kingdom based on their terms, a kingdom based on their propensities, a kingdom based on what they wanted, a kingdom basically in their own image, where they ran the kingdom.
But we're still putting God in a box today when you talk to various people.
In respect of the kingdom, you mean?
To the kingdom and what God can do and what His sovereignty is, and they have to perform certain rituals.
But even
depending on the context.
than that, I think even that just reminds me of, I was just talking, I've been at Bible study actually, that people nowadays make their own religions to suit them.
Supermarket religions.
So kind of like, pick whatever they want.
Yeah, a la carte.
And then they make their to suit them. It's never...
That's the nature of every cult that's ever existed.
Can I ask a question?
You can
I know
indeed.
I'm jumping ahead. I'm jumping ahead.
It's okay.
Just because it caught my eye.
Sure,
and
but
it
go
does
ahead.
kind of tie in with, obviously, it'll tie in.
Well, that's fine, yeah. Go ahead.
So in 22:2, where it says they... and when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. Is that because what you're saying before, that only certain people spoke Hebrew? It wasn't like a common...
Yeah, rabbis.
So it showed that he was a rabbi or a Sanhedrin as well. So
it gave him even more kudos.
Yeah, correct. But again, you are 100% correct. Yes, and this is. I'll make the point now. It's fine. I can make it again next week. But But again, this is the hypocrisy. You've just touted how supposedly on the side of the law of God you are, and then you beat him to a pulp. And basically, when I say beat him to a pulp, we're not just like sending the Stoozy boys around with baseball bats to teach you a lesson. I mean, like, you tried to kill him.
beaten to death.
Yeah, correct. Beaten to death, potentially stoned, however they were doing it. No trial, no judge, no witnesses, nothing. Nothing at all. Completely and utterly violating the law of God in every imaginable way out of hatred and blindness and deception. And then as soon as he starts speaking to you in Hebrew, you start treating him with reverence because he's a rabbi. Oh, this is a man we should respect. Oh, he's speaking Hebrew. Oh, I got to listen to him. You respect. You know, you just tried to murder him, guys. Like the complete. It's almost borderline schizophrenic. Like it's so bipolar, and I say that figuratively, not literally. So where was that respect 5 minutes ago? I'm saying that figuratively, it's not literally five, but you get my picture. Where was that respect 5 minutes ago when you just tried to murder him in the streets without a trial? Right? And now you're trying to show deference and reverence because you've now realized, oh, he's a rabbi, or he's a teacher of the law, and because he's speaking Hebrew. That's the evidence.
But we see that today too. Like, you know, you might try to talk to somebody about Christian things, blah, blah, blah. Then they find out that you're actually a scholar and an intellectual. Suddenly you change to...
I've had that happen multiple times.
Yeah, it still happens today.
I've had that happen in conversations where then people find out about my academic background, and then all of a sudden the whole dynamic of the conversation, now they're willing to listen. Well, I'm not saying anything different than I was saying 10 seconds ago, guy. What are you doing? Like, why are you now giving me, could have been to you? Who gives us stuff? But that's it's the credential. So basically this is actually, the faux virtue of this, right? See, giving reverence to him and deference and respect, in other words, or whatever word you want to use there, because he's a teacher of the law is a good thing. Except for the fact you just tried to murder him 5 minutes ago, right? So what's actually a virtue is complete and utter hypocrisy right now in this context. Because 5 minutes ago, this rabbi, this teacher that you're showing reference and deference towards, you just tried to murder completely unlawfully. This is so blindingly hypocritical that it's almost beyond description. Yes. So yes, good pointing out. He does that, but again, this is purposeful. That's why I said last week that over the coming chapters, including you're gonna witness a masterclass on Paul's part in almost basically a kind of rhetorical tactics.
Even down to
utter masterclass.
what language he chooses to use at what time.
Oh, utter masterclass. So he waits until he's been beaten, hasn't resisted it at all, not because of some like pacifistic piety, but because by allowing them to beat the living daylights out of him, it just heaps judgment on their heads. Yeah. It's pouring out judgment. Because then he can turn right around and say to the very people who are supposedly touting how law-abiding they are, about how they just trashed the law 6 ways to Sunday by doing the way that they did. And they're going to do it again in the Sanhedrin. You're going to see that come up again, this kangaroo court, which happens in verse 23. This absolute joke of a concept of justice that they're trying to enact here. But yeah, choosing when he waits, he's not saying anything to the Romans until they probably start probably saying to, hey, do you reckon this is the guy we've been looking for from it? And that's when he chimes in and does so in Greek. Or what, he speaks Greek, because that's how he's then setting them up in chapter 22 for them then learning that he's a Roman citizen. You're going to see that play out. I'll say that for next week.
And the Tribune should have been on top of that. That's a big...
That's why I said he missed that. Look, I think contextually, I'm trying to be very fair to the Romans here, because this situation would have been absolutely wild and chaotic. They're scrambling. They're trying to figure out, they're in the middle, they're trying also not to probably get over on themselves, because there's a riot of violent Jews assaulting this guy, and as they're extracting him back to the fortress, they're chasing after, like I'm saying, it's a frenzy at this point. It's just a frenzy of tiger sharks. And so in the midst of all that and the shouting, you can imagine how loud it'd be, blah, blah, blah. And that's what I'm saying to you, you have to be, if you read a lot of novels, you're going to be good at reading these kinds of narratives, because that's when you're reading narratives, you have to not add things in, but you have to read between the lines. You have to understand context. So when it's like, oh, and he said, you have to imagine a gigantic crowd of thousands, people, probably even tens of thousands at this point now, because it's all been building, who are screaming and shouting, and they're all yelling, the soldiers are yelling commands to each other, and he turns to him, and as in Paul, and starts speaking to him in Greek, and he looks at him shocked, and their voices are up here, and it's all yelling and elevated because they're trying to hear it.
Over the crowd.
Yeah. So it's all that. So him missing that he said he was a citizen, it's understandable. But it's a key detail, very, very key detail. Just him saying a citizen gets missed entirely, because you're going to see that play out in chapter 22. Okay. Yeah.
And a significant city
Yeah, Tarsus was not. Tarsus had one of the most famous.
But he actually said, I'm a citizen of a significant city.
Yeah, it was a significant city of Tarsus. Yeah, correctly. A Greek city through and through. Built there,
Significant.
couple hundred miles north of Antioch. Yeah, in the far east of the Mediterranean, southern Turkey, what is today.
He gave the tribune every hint on the plate.
No, yeah, correct. Yes, exactly. But that's so that then his words are then recounted and recorded. He's being it's not a long statement. He doesn't say much. He just simply says, well, all he literally says is, may I say something to you? And then says, I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of a significant city, and I beg you allow me to speak to people. That's all he said. So he's very selective in the word. I'm saying to you, you're about to witness an absolute masterclass, because without being smart, Paul is a very, very intelligent guy. That's why he was a rabbi. He wasn't just merely a rabbi. He was, as we've seen before, and as he's about to remind people here, he was one of the most famous teachers of the law of his generation. Incredible talent in the school of Gamaliel. He's a very intelligent guy. Smarter than probably every one of us.
In the movie The Life of Brian, where they're having a meeting and they just show such insight into these times. What have the Romans ever done for us?
Right.
They've given us aqueducts, roads,
Yeah, besides that,
law, peace,
Yeah, you're right.
Apart from that, what else have they done for us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good point. Yeah. No, good point.
did Paul have a family or anything like that?
No.
It was just
So Paul chose to remain celibate, chose to remain single. The vast majority of the other apostles did marry. They had family and kids. Peter does. John does, etc. Everyone else does. Broadly speaking, none of the other apostles do. He chooses to remain that way. He mentions this in some of his epistles, particularly to the Corinthians, for example. Especially the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, for example. But nevertheless, he chooses to remain, without family. Because without question, in terms of hostility, among the apostles, Paul faced the most by a wide margin. Consistently. All the apostles other than John were martyred, but I'm talking about across the span of the life, not just their death. The whole course of their life. His life has been
Plus, he was always travelling.
rough.
He was always travelling, so that's...
Oh, sure, yeah. So that adds an extra element.
You can move quicker when you're just by yourself.
Move quicker by yourself. Yeah. So instead of I need lodging for me and my wife and my 4 kids, right?
Well, he was talking about less responsibilities, other responsibilities to distract him, I think.
Yeah, he does mention that. He mentions the fact that that's why again, he refers to a number of the churches that he founds as his children, right? So in that spiritual sense, like a church. That's why, by the way, and I pointed this out, even in the Baptist church. Protestants sometimes, it happens in Anglicanism and Lutheranism, but outside of those two kind of traditions, Protestants sometimes balk at the reference to ministers as father, like we usually think of in the Roman Catholic context, for example. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm not asking to be called that, especially in the dynamic of this church where I'm one of the youngest people here. That's not what I'm asking for. What I'm saying though is that the reference to the pastors, the ministers of that congregation as father it's a term of endearment in the same respect that Paul calls himself that.
It describes a type of leadership as well.
Yeah, it's familial. It's not just it's not like in a political sense.
Yeah.
There's
like
a familial.
They call each other brother as well. They're not necessarily.
No, correct. They call each other brother in the faith.
So
the brotherhood. Love the brotherhood,
the
like it
father's
says.
obviously head of the household, so it's like
you're
showing them.
Yeah, the head.
That
Leadership and guidance and protection, all those things that are tight. Yeah, exactly. And often the scripture that gets cited against that is, call no man father. But that's right in the heels of him saying, call no man teacher, even though everyone calls him, Jesus, a teacher of the law. So it's not taking it in context. He's using a figure of speech. I'm making a broader point about God the Father, not human fathers. And so, it's not... Anyway, my point is that that's where that comes from, because Paul himself refers to himself as a father to the Corinthians, for example, and elsewhere. But that's why, so he doesn't have a family. Most of the other apostles do. Peter does, for example.
Peter had a family before even Jesus called him, I think. Didn't he? He was married.
That could be true. It's entirely possible that's true. I need to go back and look and refresh myself of that early portions of his life.
Because he had a house, they went round to his place.
No, I know. That's what gives me the inclination to say yes. I need to go back. It's just simple. I wouldn't have looked at it in a couple of years, so I need to go back and have a look. But yes, I suspect the answer is probably yes. But anyway, he definitely did have a family, and most of the apostles had families actually. The vast majority of them, and Paul's kind of the exception to the rule almost. Yes, which is why, by the way, and this is a tangential point, but it came up. He was talking about that question. That's why context is always important. So Paul, on the one instance, advises in his epistles, I think he advises the Corinthians, if you're unmarried, stay unmarried. And so then that then is taken, and if you take that out of context, you run with that and go, oh, well, if I'm unmarried now at the time that I happen to be reading this particular scripture, I should state, well, but no though, because he's writing to the church of Corinth at a specific time, in a specific place, to them, for everyone, but to them, right? So that's point number one. Point number two is he then also goes on elsewhere, not only in the rest of his epistles, but also to the Corinthians, giving instructions for husbands and wives. But so if you take this singular command, or in other words, or advice, or wisdom, whatever you want to call it, of if you are unmarried at the moment, stay unmarried, so you can be of greater benefit to the church, and blah, blah, and take that as a universal principle out of context, then you can't make heads and tails of him then giving all this advice about marriage later on.
Well, he also says if you find yourself married to an unbeliever, when you become a believer,
Well, yeah,
just stay married.
Yeah, that's 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and elsewhere, yes. And so that's why taking things in context is always important, because they're not contradictory. He's giving specific advice in a specific instance, and elsewhere it's generally very clear where something is a universal principle. So like, for example, let's think of one. So, for example, speaking of marriage or speaking of men and women and whatnot, and I've mentioned this before, the natural order of how God has ordered the world and created the world regarding what the roles and responsibilities of women are and what they are for men, right? The reason why we know that's a universal principle is because his appeal is not to, and this I'm talking especially in the book of Ephesians here, is not to something specific in Ephesus. He doesn't make any reference to the Artemisian cult. He doesn't make any reference to the Artemisian priesthood. He makes no reference in Corinthians to the cult of Aphrodite. His comment is about Adam and Eve and about the creation. He goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. Right? He's talking about nature as in the order of the world. It's clearly a universal principle if he's appealing all the way back to the foundation of the world itself, right? Contextual things like his one specific reference, which is almost in passing, but his specific reference to if you are currently single, stay single, or if you're currently unmarried, stay married, has a whole host of very obviously contextual references. That's how we determine those kinds of differences. It's not just arbitrary of, oh, well, I think this suits my opinion, so I'm going to go with, like, no, it's the text that makes the difference, right? There are other areas of scripture like that too, that's another discussion.
Out of context, being taken, let's say, by Catholic priests who have to remain celibate.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of that is, so that's one of the texts that gets used.
That was so they could keep money in the church.
A lot, yeah. So there's a whole host of other later developments. By the time you get to clerical celibacy, starts to come about out of the monastic orders. There are positives and negatives to monasticism in Christianity, which is a much more complex historical conversation.
It's not just a rabbit hole; it's the whole warren. Yeah,
it's the whole warren, and it's complex. It's not just oh, this thing bad or this thing good. It's much more complex than that. But celibacy, clerical celibacy, in other words, celibacy of ministers and other such figures, is something that comes out of the monastic tradition of the 4th and 5th centuries, particularly certainly by the 5th century. The Desert Fathers, other such figures, the Cappadocian Fathers, people will cover when we get to the church history. And then it develops in terms of on the clerical level, the clergy level, kind of really by the early medieval period. That's where its fruition start to take pretty firm root. And there's a whole host of reasons as to why. Now, there's a variety of pragmatic reasons that actually end up being of benefit, right? Because there are benefits. That's why Paul gives that advice in that specific instance, because the impetus to him giving it is you can be of greater use.
Yeah, that's what he says.
Right?
Yeah.
And he also gives it to the Corinthians, who he knows, again, keeping in mind in the context of the first century, when this massive judgment is about to come barreling down upon Jerusalem, and by extension, it's going to flow elsewhere, right? Things are going to get rough, right? so then he's also thinking clearly in the context of that passage about what's the polite way of putting this? The decision making, so the burden on someone if they're unmarried in regards to their decisions about how strongly they're going to stand in opposition to something, often are much easier if you don't have to have in the back of your head, is this particular action I'm about to take going to get my wife and my children crucified?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a simple way of putting it. Those decisions are often much easier when you don't have immediate loved ones who are going to be...
That they can be used against you in leverage, essentially.
That is one of the driving reasons. And context determines that.
Because I always wondered whether this particular concept was a misinterpretation of scripture, or if it's just something that's been
in regards to the celibacy thing.
Yeah.
Well, look, it's blind universal application to the clergy is a misreading of that text. Yes, okay. It came with a host of benefits. It also came with a host of problems.
Oh, we're seeing today.
Yeah. So, and this is not, and again, this is why having a reasonable adult discussion about these things is the framework in which these occur, which is a skill that's almost entirely faded from Western culture at the moment. So point number one I'd make is that contrary to common or popular perception, especially through media, the rate of sexual abuse perpetrated by clergy is no higher than it is for the general populace, and in certain jurisdictions it's actually less. Now, at the same time, the number should actually be zero. But it's also both reasonable to examine the fact that it should be zero, but we also are human beings who live in this world, not in some fantasy utopia, where everyone does everything perfectly good all the time, right? You can say both things at the same time.
I keep saying the media doesn't pick on their uncles and stepdads and all.
Oh, no one gives a hoot. No, it's very selective. It's extremely selective.
Yeah.
No.
I think the reason is though when you've got people that are in power and have with that job comes the expectation that you're going to hold certain standards, have certain standards, and then they fall short while the whole time pointing at you, going. And I'm not saying that all.
No, but that's a reasonable thing.
We tend to concentrate on the Catholic Church for this, but all this stuff happens through all denominations. It's not. But it's specifically...
It's a distraction from the actual family value or the family unit that should be protecting against this as well.
Yeah, correct. That's my point, is that part of the issue, and again, this doesn't excuse it, what it does is it just simply puts it in context, is that clerical celibacy as a mandation, which I don't agree with, for biblical reasons, but it has had a whole host of protections. Like, for example, I'll use a parallel example to make the point I'm trying to make here. Throughout basically the entire medieval period and even beyond, and we kind of still generally hold it even today in certain respects. It's more complex now, but anyway, it was absolutely forbidden by law to conscript or to otherwise raise into the feud or the army clerics or clergymen.
Isn't it?
Yeah, I'm saying it is. It depends on what we're talking. It's more complex legally now, but point being is that if you go back to, I'm just picking a random time, so there was no, when the call for the Crusades occurred, no one at all, not only was no one expecting the local minister or priest of a given church in, say, France to join, he expressly was forbidden from fighting, right? So it was illegal to, I'm using a modern term, conscript. It was illegal to conscript clergy into an army. Right? Now that had a whole host of benefits, the foremost of which is the fact that clergy, as one of the single most educated men in their entire village or town or city, are a very valuable resource, and having them wind up dead as part of the cannon fodder on a battlefield was not exactly conducive to a functioning society. Right? They were too valuable an asset for you to lose on a battlefield. Right? Let the peasantry do that. Let the knights do that. Let the nobility do that, right? And so that came with. There's good reasons for doing it. In the same sense, on this side of clerical celibacy or the celibacy of clergy, there's a whole host of benefits their ability to, for example, their ability to be moved around to a different church as needed, right? One of the priests or one of the bishops dies, right? And you need that sense of like mobility almost, right? Of we need to bring in this guy, we need to move him around to this town. He's in this town in England, we need to move him to this town in England, right? So that's a lot easier, again, when you don't have a wife and 6 kids to move along with you, right? There's a whole host of other practical benefits that came with it. The issues, though, is then the repression of the created order of who, in this case specifically, men and women are, but particularly and specifically now in this case, men. Marriage is the design. That's what it should normally be. That's what it should be en masse. It's, again, in reference to Paul, his celibacy is almost unique among the apostles themselves. That itself is proof positive of the very concept I'm talking about. And so the repression of that, arbitrary is an interesting word in that context. But anyway, the repression of that by mandation, right, is what can lead to those scenarios, right? It's no different than saying, for example, men should absolutely not rape women, and that's obvious. And also, you don't need to dress promiscuously, right? Both can be true at the exact same time, right?
And one doesn't excuse the other.
No, one doesn't excuse the other. So dressing promiscuously doesn't go, oh, she deserved to be raped. No, that's never the case. She was asking for it. No, she wasn't. No, never the case. Never been the case, and that's never the words that should be used. That's never the reality.
Yeah.
But hey, at the same time, dangling mutton in front of the lion cage isn't going to turn out well. And this is my point, is because the kind of guy that would do that is a wolf. Right? So it goes both, so it's not an either or, it's a both and. Oh, she deserved it. No, she didn't deserve it. That's not what I'm saying. That's what I've never said. But at the same time, though...
Just these women, I'm sorry, but they get around, don't objectify me. And they've got their boobs
As they're objectifying themselves, right? That's the, but that's part of that's the kind of hypocrisy I'm talking about.
That's like the woman who's got a very low cut top, right? And the guy's just looking her in the eyes. No, my boobs are down here.
Yeah,
yes, exactly. It's the same concept. It's not. That's what I'm saying. It's not an either or. It's a both and. Yeah, exactly. It's a both and.
One thing that, just because I just flicked to that 1 Corinthians thing where it says, where he says. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. Yeah. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. Blah blah blah. But then when you go down to 17, it says, "Live as you are called. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all churches." So in other words, find your thing, find your calling. Where's God leading you?
Yeah,
do
that. Exactly, and we can apply that broadly. Obviously, in that context, it's about marriage. Yeah, so for those who are called to, but if you're called to that, the context of that will be very obvious. So for Paul, it was. Yeah. For the vast majority, though, he's saying that's not going to be it for you. Yep.
But it's also against it goes against church jumping. You come across quite a few people who are going between several churches.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
How can you apply that first then?
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good point. It's the way when it happens that way. Yeah. I mean, look, that's a whole other subject, I guess. But yeah. The issue with people who are constantly moving around from church to church, like constantly, is that in one form or another, to one degree or another, depending on the person, they're demanding a level from a given congregation that is not just merely unreasonable to expect, it's also bordering on pride, right? It almost basically ends up becoming, especially someone who does it like habitually, it ends up almost becoming, this place isn't good enough for me, right? It's demanding a level of doctrinal or even behavioral perfection that is just not just only unreasonable, it's actually unbiblical to expect. So for example, I'm speaking an example here, in regards to eschatology, I'm certainly in the minority here. Okay. And that's not a problem. That's not, so in regards to eschatology, yeah, so in regards to subjects like the nature of the kingdom, prophecy in the Old Testament, Book of Revelation, Olivet Discourse, variety of things. But see, if I was to then go, this one particular, not that it's unimportant, it's a very important subject, but I have a personal disagreement with what the majority happen to hold here. That means I'm going to leave. Where do we see that being a permissible reason in the scriptures at all? It's like where in the church of Corinth does he give that permission to the Corinthians to if you have a doctrinal disagreement, important, unimportant, or otherwise, you should pick up shop and go move over to Ephesus, or move to Athens, or move to Thessaloniki, or it doesn't happen. It's demanding something. It's demanding basically that the church conform to your image, not the other way around. Not the other way around. It's demanding that the church conform to your personal standards, not the other way around. No, the whole purpose of submitting to the church is that if the church is submitting to Christ, you're submitting to Christ through the church. That's the whole point. The church is not about me. The church is about us, and more importantly, the church is about Him. And so to demand that then everyone then the church demand that the church know this, I must find a place that perfectly aligns with every single point of doctrine that I currently hold.
You won't find one.
You won't find one.
And that could also be supermarket belief.
It's the same thing. It's a la carte Christianity, where we're just picking and choosing off a menu, and it's also the same impetus.
How do you grow if you're in a church whereby there's never discussion?
So that's where then the context. That's what I said at the very beginning. That's what I said. I'm saying it depends on the context. I said to one degree or another, right? It depends on the context. There's an element in which forbearing is the course of action. There are other elements in which moving on somewhere else is then going to be. But the point is that in the modern time, we're super trigger happy to just jump straight into pick up shop and move somewhere else without any concept of forbearance. It's the same kind of, it's a more ultimate and kind of abrupt example, but it's the consequence of the whole kind of thing I'm talking about. Is that it's like when someone leaves Christianity because someone in the church did something bad. The minister had an affair with such and such. Or let me put it in context what I'm saying here, so no one misinterprets what I mean. It's not that I'm not acknowledging. It's not that I'm rejecting their hurt, their pain, the general anxiety over something bad having happened. It's not that I'm saying that it's not real or that it's irrelevant or you just need to get no, none of that. All those are legitimate. Disappointment, yeah, all those things. All those things are legitimate. All those things are reasonable to expect. But at the same time, if that's caused you to leave the Christian religion, then your faith ultimately was never in Christ. It was in the group of friends and people that you had in this particular little community.
It was a church club.
It was a church club. Yes, correct. It was like my golf club or my local RSL mishandled funds, and that's why I've left. Well, that makes sense because it's a club. Right.
And I think also, there are times when you do need to leave a church because the teaching's either gone askew or you're not growing anymore because it's too wishy-washy. I've been in churches where
I can understand that entirely, sure.
Just,
you're not more corrosive to the soul than it is.
You try to stick with it, and that's these other people won't even do that. They'll just trigger straight away.
Yeah, this is my point about the whole forbearance versus the parachute option, right?
Yeah.
Is that everyone is on standby with their hand ready to launch the parachute. That's my point, and that's my problem. I haven't been part of many churches. I was part of outside of the school because I was raised in Anglican schools. Part of a church inside school context, and then outside of that was part of a Baptist church up here in the mountains. Obviously, once school had finished, that's done. So that's the only other church I've ever been part of, and I was literally kicked out of it. Okay.
What, out of the Anglican one?
No. Well, I said the Anglican one. I just finished high school, so that's that. I'm saying the other, not an Anglican church, another denomination, Baptist church.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
So I didn't make the choice to leave that place. I was functionally driven out of it. Okay, so at that point, it's not on me anymore, right?
It's almost like, it's a club. It's not a church.
Well, yeah, and I had no ill will at all.
Okay. That's pretty impressive.
It just is what it is. That's the whole point of forgiveness. Is that part of the forgiveness is you're not really forgiving someone if you keep holding on to any bitterness or any anger.
Yeah, true.
It's not genuine forgiveness. And so, but that's just a statement. It's more a statement of factor of observation. And so and so point being is that then, like, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I think I can speak pretty authoritatively to it, because it's not like I've parachuted out of a place. I actually stuck in literally quite long, as long as I could, until I was eventually driven out. Right. And so that's kind of my point is, the whole is that then jumping around to try and find a place that suits every bit of the menu of what I'm looking for. What's the perspective? Is it me looking for what I'm looking for, or is it me actually looking for how the church is meant to be in the first place? Now, what that looks like, again, complex. I'm just saying to you, it could be forbearing, and those points you make about all those are legit. I get all that. That all makes sense. It's the jumping to the parachute option at the first sign of trouble. That's the kind of thing I'm talking against. But yeah.
Just on a side issue, when you were talking about that they couldn't enlist clergy into the army, in the RFS we don't say this very often, but if they have to triage, be evacuating or treating, the RFS get evacuated first or get treated first before the citizens.
Yep.
Because they can come back to fight another day.
Yeah, correct, and that's part. Yes, exactly. And there's a whole host of that's where in an emergency scenario, in a disaster scenario, you have to, as discompassionate as it might seem, that's kind of the point of the discompassion. You have to actually, you have to almost triage itself what the order of rescuing people has to be. Unfortunately, that's just the way that the cookie crumbles. No, it's no different than in
It's the same with
a mass casualty event when you have you have some bus overturning and now you've got 20-something people rolling to the hospital. You have to grade whether those injuries are life-threatening, and if the ED goes into a full condition of mass casualty, and I'm sure you probably know, obviously. This person's losing too much blood, they're not going to make it. No, we need to give this bag to this person. And we have to triage this person first, and this is the priority. No, can't save him, move on. No, don't attempt to resuscitate. Things that would otherwise normally happen have to be. So yes.
Very moving emotion from this.
Yeah, discompassion, yes, correct, yes. Any other questions or anything else? Cool. All right. So yes, next week we move on to the next chapter, and we're going to be knocking out the bulk of that chapter, in fact. Mainly because a lot of the chapter, a lot of his speech is him recounting his life, basically.
It's just doing a recap.
A lot of the details we've covered, and a lot of it is fairly self-explanatory anyway. So there's not like a whole not a gigantic depth of things we're going to have to dive into per se. A lot of it is him just recounting the details we've covered in this book anyway. So, anyway, there we go. Thank you.